The Devil in the Cornfield, an American Horror in Cutchogue. Chapter 1, A Knock in the Dead of Night. It was past midnight on a warm, early summer night in 1854 when a frantic pounding on William Betts' door shattered the stillness of Cutchogue's main road. Betts and his wife jolted awake at the thunderous knocks echoing through their farmhouse. Outside, two young women's voices screamed for help, their words tumbling over one another in terror. Betts threw on a robe and rushed to unlatch the door, heart pounding with dread at the urgency in those cries. When the door flew open, the sight was ghastly. Ellen Holland and Catherine Dowd, servant girls from the nearby Wickham farm, stood barefoot and wild-eyed, their nightclothes stained with dirt and sweat. They had fled into the darkness moments earlier, and now their chests heaved as they struggled to speak. Catherine's hands left bloody smears on the doorframe. She had cut herself scrambling from an attic window. "Help! Help, please!" Ellen gasped, voice breaking. For a moment, neither could form a full sentence. Only fragments spilled out. Mr. and Mrs. Wickham attacked Nicholas and Axe. Their faces were masks of shock, eyes glassy with horror as they tried to convey the unimaginable crime they had just escaped. Betts felt a chill seize him at the name Nicholas. He knew at once who they meant. Nicholas Behan, often called Bane by locals, the hot-tempered Irish farmhand recently dismissed from the Wickham estate. A flicker of dread and anger coursed through him. Just 2 days earlier, James Wickham had warned that he'd had to evict the unruly laborer for causing trouble. Now it seemed those troubles had exploded into violence. Catherine was sobbing incoherently, and Ellen, pale and trembling, managed to choke out, "He's killed them, Mr. Betts! The Wickhams! He's killed them!" By now, a few neighbors had noticed the commotion and lit lamps in their windows. Joseph Corwin, another neighbor and friend of the Wickhams, arrived moments later, drawn by the screams in the night. Dr. John Carpenter, the village physician, followed close behind, lacing up his boots as he ran. In hushed, urgent breaths, Ellen and Catherine recounted the nightmare. How Nicholas had burst into the farmhouse with an axe, how they'd heard Mrs. Frances Wickham's screams and Mr. James Wickham's agonized cries. "Nicholas, don't kill him! Don't kill him!" Frances had pleaded moments before a final terrible silence fell. The girls had only just escaped with their lives, crawling out onto a lower roof and leaping to the ground as Nicholas tried to break into their attic room. Betts felt the hair on his neck rise at the recounting. James and Frances Wickham, his neighbors, respected members of the community, attacked in their own home. The reality was nearly impossible to grasp. But the blood on the girls and their trembling terror left no room for doubt. An evil had descended on their peaceful hamlet, an evil carrying an axe in the face of a man they all knew. Betts exchanged a grim, knowing look with Dr. Carpenter and Mr. Corwin. There would be time for fear later. Now they had to act. One by lantern light, Betts retrieved his hunting rifle from above the hearth. Corwin hastily armed himself with a pistol and handed Carpenter a stout club. "Stay here with my wife," Betts urged the girls, but Ellen shook her head violently. Little Stephen's still there," she cried, voice quavering. "We think he's hurt bad." Stephen Winston was the 14-year-old houseboy who slept above the kitchen. In their panicked escape, the girls hadn't seen him follow. Now they realized he must still be inside with the killer. Betts placed a reassuring hand on Ellen's shoulder, masking his own dread. "We'll get him," he promised quietly. Turning to the others, he barked, "Let's go." Together, the band of men plunged into the darkness toward the Wickham farm down the lonely lane. Their lantern jittered light across the dirt road and surrounding cornfields. In the distance, the Wickham farmhouse loomed as a black silhouette against the starry sky. No flicker of candlelight inside, no sign of life, only an eerie, oppressive stillness. As they neared the yard, a single high-pitched keening carried on the night breeze. The Wickham's loyal dog, tied up in the barn, howling mournfully into the darkness. Otherwise, the only sound was the scuff of the men's boots and their heavy breathing. Betts could feel his heart hammering as he stepped onto the porch, which was smeared with something dark. He didn't dare inspect it closely just yet. "James, Frances," he called out, praying for any reply. None came. Gathering his courage, Betts tried the front door. Locked. Corwin circled around back and discovered the kitchen door hanging ajar, likely where Nicholas had broken in. He gestured in silence, and the men slipped into the house single file, armed and ready. Carpenter lit a lamp with trembling hands, casting a warm glow that revealed a scene from a nightmare. Gasps of horror escaped the men's throats before they could stifle them. Crimson streaks of blood smeared the walls and floor of the main hallway. The heavy coppery scent hit them immediately. They followed the gruesome trail up the staircase, each step revealing more carnage. At the top of the stairs in the second-floor bedroom lay Frances Wickham. Even to the untrained eye, it was clear she was beyond saving. Her skull had been caved in by vicious blows, leaving a large portion of brain matter strewn across the hardwood floor. Carpenter froze, momentarily overcome by the brutality. Frances's delicate form crumpled on the rug, her nightdress soaked with blood, her face mercifully turned away. He forced himself to kneel and feel for a pulse he knew he would not find. James Wickham was collapsed a few feet away at the foot of the bed, sprawled on his back. His head was bashed and bleeding, but to Bets's astonishment, James gurgled a faint, wet breath when the lantern light fell on him. "He's alive!" Bets cried hoarsely. James's eyes fluttered open, dazed and unseeing, as Carpenter rushed to his side. Blood cascaded from a severe wound on James's temple, and he was choking weakly on blood pooling in his throat. Carpenter carefully cradled James's head, trying to stanch the bleeding with a handkerchief. James's lips moved as if to speak, but only a frothy rattle came out. Within moments, his body shuddered and went still. James Wickham's lingering fight for life ended just minutes after his wife's, sometime around 2 a.m. on that ill-fated night. A groan from the kitchen wing wrenched the men's attention. They followed the sounds to a narrow back stair and found young Stephen Winston in a bloody heap on the floor of his tiny attic room above the kitchen. Astonishingly, he was alive, though barely. Stephen's dark skin had gone ashen with shock, and blood matted his hair. A jagged wound had sheared off one of his ears, and his skull was fractured from multiple axe blows. The boy's chest rose and fell in shallow pants. He was unconscious and badly maimed, but clinging to life. Carpenter whispered, "Dear God," and immediately set about bandaging his head with strips torn from a bedsheet. The men worked swiftly, knowing every second mattered if the boy was to survive. Bets's hands shook with rage and grief as he looked around the ravaged household. This was the same gracious home where he and his wife had dined with the Wickhams not long ago, enjoying Frances's famous peach pie in the parlor. Now the parlor doorway was spattered with the Wickhams' own blood. How could such evil visit Cutchogue? He thought. In all his years, Bets had never seen a murder victim, let alone a scene of outright butchery such as this. South Old Town hadn't recorded a murder in 3 decades. This idyllic farming community had seemed immune to the violence of the wider world. Yet here lay James and Frances, beloved neighbors, slaughtered in their nightclothes. A horrific crime did not begin to describe what Nicholas had wrought upon this household. Bets's jaw tightened as he surveyed the evidence of the killer's identity. Near the open window, a dark, wide-brimmed hat lay trampled on the floor, the hat Nicholas Bain was known to wear, abandoned in his panicked flight. On the floorboards leading back downstairs, enormous bloody boot prints were visible, each one unmistakably made by a large man's feet. Nicholas stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a heavy step. No one else in town could have left those prints. The blood on them was still tacky. He had been here only minutes before the girls raised the alarm. Now he was loose in the dark, armed and stained with the blood of his employers. As Carpenter and Corwin carefully lifted Stephen's limp form to carry him to a neighbor's house for medical care, Betts gently drew a bedsheet over Frances and James's bodies. "We'll come back for them," he whispered, voice catching. The men stepped out into the cool night air, where a handful of neighbors had now gathered with lanterns and anxious faces. Word of the atrocity was spreading rapidly, lighting up the hamlet house by house like fireflies in the night air. A shocked murmur rippled through the small crowd as they learned of the Wickhams' fate. Some of the women began to weep. Others looked toward the dark trees with fear that the axe-wielding devil might still be lurking. Betts gently handed Stephen off to a pair of sturdy farmers, who rushed the wounded boy to the doctor's surgery down the road. Then Betts turned to face the rest of the townsfolk assembled in the yard, their faces grim in the lantern light. He realized many held weapons, muskets, pistols, even pitchforks, whatever they grabbed after being roused from bed by the news. Anger was growing among them, mixed with terror. The Wickhams were not just respected, they were loved. James was known for his generosity and Frances for her kindness. To harm them so brutally was an unspeakable offense to everyone in this close-knit community. Betts raised his rifle. "Nicholas Behan has murdered James and Frances Wickham," he announced in a low, steady voice that nonetheless carried across the yard. "He's fled into the night, but by God, we will find him." A rumble of agreement answered him. Hardened farmers cocked back the hammers of their guns. Others lit extra torches. The cry went up, "Find Bain! Find the murderer!" In that instant, a posse was born. The North Fork's long peace was broken, replaced by an outraged cry for justice. Somewhere out there in the darkness of the surrounding fields and forests, Nicholas was running for his life. Every man present silently vowed that by sunrise, if Nicholas Behan was still on Long Island, he would be either captured or killed. With grim resolve, they fanned out into the night, beginning one of the largest manhunts the East End had ever seen. The air was thick with apprehension, and the smoke of torches as neighbors set off in twos and threes, disappearing into the inky woods. What none of them could. 12, 13, 14, 15, 14, 13, 12, 16, 3 know was just how far this tragedy stretched back into the past. How the seeds of that night's horror had been planted years before, in both the Wickham family's prosperous history and Nicholas Behan's tortured journey to Cutchogue. Those seeds had taken root in the rich soil of the North Fork, watered by prejudice, desperation, and rage, until finally yielding this poisonous harvest of blood. As the search parties combed the cornfields and wetlands for the axe murderer, a lone lantern remained behind at the Wickham farmhouse. Its light fell on a chilling tableau, the empty, shattered bedroom, and the bloody handprints on the windowsill where Frances Wickham had made a futile attempt to escape. In that hollow silence, the truth was laid bare. An ordinary summer night had turned into a nightmare that would haunt Cutchogue for generations to come. Chapter 2. The Wickham Farm. By all appearances, the Wickham Farm was a pastoral haven, a proud embodiment of Long Island's North Fork tranquility. The farmhouse itself was a weathered but stately structure built in the early 1700s, nestled at the end of a long dirt lane that led south from Main Road. The home sat on a gentle rise near Wickham Creek, flanked by fertile fields and orchards that stretched toward Peconic Bay. On a typical morning, the sun would spill over rows of corn and wheat, glinting off the creek's waters and warming the old shingles of the house. Neat fences bordered the property, and a tidy farmyard held a barn, a milkhouse, and chicken coops. Everything about the scene spoke of order, prosperity, and peace. That peace had deep roots. The Wickham family's American story went back to the 17th century. They were originally English dissenters who fled religious persecution and sailed to New England. One forebear, Joseph Wickham, established the family on Long Island's East End. In 1698, Joseph moved to Cutchogue and purchased a colonial homestead and 160 acres of rich farmland that ran from the King's Highway, today's Main Road, all the way south to the bay. He built a sturdy home known simply as the Old House, which still stands today on the village green, and began cultivating the land. Joseph's gamble paid off. The North Fork soil was fertile and yielded abundant crops supporting generations of Wickhams. The farm was passed down to Joseph's son and onward, remaining in family hands for over a century. The Wickhams became one of the North Fork's founding families, intertwined with local history. They weathered the turbulence of the American Revolution, though not unscathed. During the war, some Wickhams remained loyalists due to their English roots. James's great-uncle, John Wickham, even gained notoriety later as the lawyer who defended Aaron Burr in his treason trial. But such loyalist sympathies came at a cost. At the Revolution's end, New York State confiscated certain loyalist properties, and the original Wickham homestead was lost for a time. Still, the family rebounded in the 1800s, reestablishing themselves as pillars of the community. They bought new lands, including the very farm on which James and Frances lived, acquired at auction from another family around the early 1850s, and rebuilt their prosperity. By 1854, the Wickhams were woven into the fabric of Cutchogue life, respected not just for their longevity, but for their contributions to local agriculture and society. The head of the family farm in that fateful year was 50-year-old James Wickham, Joseph's descendant, and the latest steward of the land. James had spent much of his adult life in New York City, where he co-owned a successful grocery firm called Wickham and Corwin. He was known as a savvy businessman, organized, fair-minded, and not afraid of hard work. After years in the city, James longed for a quieter life. In the early 1850s, he decided to retire back to his ancestral acreage in Cutchogue, embracing the role of a country gentleman farmer. With his financial success, he was able to invest in improving the farm 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 18, 24, 25, 26, for expanding the orchards and ensuring the latest equipment was on hand. Neighbors noted that while James had the bearing of a refined city merchant, he wasn't afraid to roll up his sleeves. One could often find him in the fields alongside his laborers, pruning fruit trees or inspecting the crops in his tailored coat and boots. James's wife, Frances Wickham, née Post, was 38 and hailed from an esteemed family of her own on Long Island's South Fork. The Posts of West Hampton were well regarded, and Frances carried herself with a gentle dignity. She had married James later in life, he in his mid-40s, she around 30, making the couple a bit older than most newlyweds of the day. They had no children, a source of quiet sorrow for them, though they doted on their nieces and nephews from their extended families. Childless but devoted to each other, James and Frances made a warm and welcoming home. Frances's nurturing instincts found an outlet in the care of her household. She treated her domestic servants kindly, almost like younger cousins, guiding them in everything from cooking to reading scripture on Sundays. Those who knew her described Frances as gracious, deeply religious, and compassionate, a woman who saw it as her duty to protect those under her roof. Daily life at the Wickham farm was a picture of rustic comfort and 19th century routine. Most mornings, James rose at dawn and took a quiet walk along the lane, often accompanied by the farm's loyal black and white sheepdog. He'd survey the crops glittering with dew and perhaps exchange a few words with his nearest neighbor, his elderly father, William Wickham Sr., who lived on another farm just a half-mile west. By breakfast time, James would return to the big farmhouse, whose kitchen would already be filled with the aroma of baking bread and brewing coffee. Frances ran the domestic side of the farm smoothly. She oversaw a small staff in the household, 2 young servant women who did the cooking and cleaning, and a teenaged boy, Stephen, who helped with odd jobs and errands. Each of these servants had come from elsewhere seeking a better life, and the Wickhams gave them that chance. After breakfast, James would meet with his farmhands to plan the day's labor. In addition to the house staff, the Wickhams employed outdoor workers to tend the fields and livestock. One was a middle-aged African-American man, freed from enslavement or born free, no one was quite sure, who had worked for the family for years. He handled the horses and plowed the fields alongside James. The other was a brawny Irish immigrant named Nicholas, who had been hired about 2 years prior. With their help, James cultivated a variety of crops. There were rows of corn and potatoes, patches of squash and peas, and a thriving orchard of peaches and apples toward the southern end of the property. The bounty of the farm was well known. In harvest season, the Wickhams would load up wagons of produce to sell in the nearby village markets or trade for goods. After the midday dinner, if the weather was fine, James and Frances might take a carriage ride together around their land, checking on how the orchards were faring or visiting friends in the village. They often stopped by William Betts's general store in town for mail and supplies. Mr. Betts was not only a merchant, but also a family friend. In fact, he later would be a key figure in the events after the murder. Life moved at the gentle pace of the seasons. Spring plantings, summer tending, fall harvests, winter pruning. Church on Sundays at the Cutchogue Presbyterian Church, occasional social calls and community gatherings. By all accounts, James and Frances were content. They had money in the bank, a beautiful old farmhouse to call home, and the respect that comes from generations of good standing in the area. What they perhaps did not fully grasp was how the winds of change beyond their farm were beginning to blow in new challenges, challenges that would arrive in the form of the very people they employed and tried to help. 27, 22, 26, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 5. One such change was the influx of immigrants in the mid-19th century, particularly Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine. James saw opportunity in this, reliable labor for his farm, and a chance to help newcomers find footing in America. He registered with an immigrant labor exchange in New York City, an agency that matched immigrants with employers who needed workers. Through this channel came Ellen Holland, the young woman who would soon become the focus of an obsessive and dangerous desire. Ellen was around 30 years old, the daughter of a farmer from County Monaghan, Ireland. She had survived the worst years of the potato famine and saved enough for passage on the ship Robert Parker, arriving in New York in late 1851. The labor exchange placed her with the Wickhams as a housemaid, and for Ellen it must have felt like a godsend. She found a stable job far from the hunger and turmoil of Ireland, in a household where she was treated with decency. Ellen was diligent and sweet-natured. She quickly became Frances' trusted assistant, and in many ways, companion. The two would spend afternoons preserving fruit or sewing in the parlor, and Frances took a protective liking to the Irish girl under her care. Another Irish immigrant arrived at the farm not long after, Nicholas Behan Bain, who would later infamously be dubbed the Devil in the Cornfield. Nicholas's backstory had some parallels to Ellen's. Both came to America escaping the devastation of the famine, but his temperament could not have been more different. Born in Ireland around 1826, Nicholas had grown up during a bitter era. By the time he was in his 20s, the potato blight struck and millions were starving. He was one of countless Irishmen who fled, arriving in New York in 1851 aboard the ship Constellation. Hardened by his experiences, Nicholas carried a deep resentment. He was Catholic and Irish through and through, arriving in a land dominated by Protestants of English descent. To his dismay, he discovered that even in rural Long Island, he couldn't escape those old ethnic grudges. The North Fork communities like Cutchogue had been founded by English colonists and were still largely populated by families with English surname Reeve, Corwin, Horton, Toothill, Terry. To Nicholas, it might have felt like he had left British oppression only to land in an Englishman's backyard in the New World. Yet Nicholas needed work, and work he found with the Wickhams. Perhaps ironically, this Irish Catholic refugee ended up laboring for a prominent Protestant family with roots tracing back to the very English he despised. Whether Nicholas took the job begrudgingly or with initial gratitude is not well recorded. At first, he did fulfill his duties reliably. He was a farmhand, a field laborer whose tasks ranged from mending fences and chopping wood to harvesting crops and tending livestock. James housed him in a small second-floor room above the kitchen, near the other servants' quarters. This meant Nicholas ate his meals in the kitchen with the household staff and slept under the same roof as the Wickhams and the two servant girls. Proximity, however, did not breed a sense of family in Nicholas's case. Instead, it seemed to fuel his resentments and darker impulses. Physically, Nicholas was an imposing figure. Townsfolk who encountered him described him as a huge, black-haired fellow with broad shoulders and a distinctive long rolling gait. The local Sag Harbor newspaper later noted his black eyes, black hair inclined to curl, high cheekbones, and that ever-present wad of chewing tobacco tucked in his cheek. He was about 28, in the prime of his strength. When he hefted an axe to chop firewood, the muscles in his arms stood out like corded rope. But along with brawn, Nicholas brought a brooding personality. Neighbors whispered that he was a bit touched in the head, owing to his unpredictable temper. It was said he often muttered to himself in Irish under his breath while working, cursing things invisible to others. 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 41, 2, 42, 43, 44, 45, 28, 46, 47, 48, 6. James gave Nicholas a fair wage and room and board, treating him as he would any hired man. But the cultural rifts were hard to bridge. Nicholas had limited literacy and little interest in the American customs of the household. When the Wickhams bowed their heads for grace at dinner, Nicholas would scowl and fiddle with his fork. At night, after the day's labor, James and Frances might retire to separate parlors to read or entertain guests, a refined habit they had brought from the city. Meanwhile, Nicholas would slip off to the local tavern if he could, or drink homemade potato liquor out by the barn with other Irish laborers. It became clear that he had a drinking problem, returning with whiskey on his breath and a sullen, even more quarrelsome demeanor. Still, for a time, no major incident occurred. The Wickhams likely hoped that with patience and firm guidance, Nicholas would settle into his role. Inside the farmhouse, nights typically ended peacefully. Frances would extinguish the oil lamps after the servants finished their cleaning, and the household would drift to sleep under the quiet of the Long Island sky. The servants' quarters were modest but comfortable. Ellen and Catherine shared a small attic bedroom directly above the Wickhams' own, and Stephen, the young black servant boy, had a cot in a tiny garret room over the kitchen. Nicholas's room, over the kitchen wing, was separated from the main house by a door and stair, a bit of physical distance that perhaps symbolized his emotional distance from the family. In the stillness before sleep, one imagines Frances might have confided to James her growing concerns about Nicholas. Perhaps she noticed how his eyes lingered too long on the girls, or how his anger flared at small provocations. James, ever the pragmatist, might have assured her that he had things under control. In those days, a wealthy farmer like James held significant authority over his hired hands. If one misbehaved, he could simply fire the fellow and hire another from the steady stream of immigrants. It was a seller's market for labor, and James likely believed that Nicholas, knowing this, would not risk losing his position. For a while, this was true. Nicholas must have recognized that despite his grievances, he had it relatively good on the Wickham farm. Regular meals, a roof, and better pay than many other jobs available to an Irishman in 1850s New York. Unfortunately, any such pragmatic restraint was eventually overcome by Nicholas's volatile mix of lust, pride, and simmering rage. The wick of conflict was lit slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It began with stolen glances and awkward conversations between Nicholas and Ellen Holland. Ellen was pretty in a fresh-faced, unassuming way. She had chestnut brown hair and kind blue eyes, along with a gentle manner that came from her devout Catholic upbringing. To Nicholas, lonely, unmarried, and rough-hewn, Ellen was likely the first Irish woman he had daily contact with since arriving in America. They shared a cultural bond and accent amid a household of Yankees, and perhaps in quiet moments, peeling potatoes or churning butter in the kitchen, they spoke of the old country. Early on, Nicholas may have mistaken camaraderie for something more. He started to court Ellen in what he considered a proper fashion. He asked her to marry him, quite out of the blue. This blunt proposal probably caught Ellen off guard. She was not interested in Nicholas. His drinking and temper aside, she likely had her eye on another local man, or simply wasn't ready for marriage. She turned him down gently, but firmly. Rejection did not sit well with Nicholas. In the tavern back in Greenport, where he occasionally went on Sundays, other Irish laborers would later recount how he grumbled about the snobby girl who thinks she's too good for an Irishman. Ellen's refusal bruised his ego deeply. He began to press the issue, following her around the farm when he had the chance, trying to get her alone. At first, it was insistent pleas. Why wouldn't she have him? Didn't she want a strong man to take care of her? Ellen, uncomfortable, tried to laugh it off or tell him to mind his work, but Nicholas's persistence only grew, and soon it turned to 49-28, 46-50, 51, 44, 52, 53, 28, 54, 7 harassment. He would corner Ellen in the barn or catch her in the pantry, reaching out to grab her arm. More than once, another servant or Frances Wickham herself walked in to find Ellen backed against a wall, with Nicholas looming too close, eyes dark with frustration. These incidents escalated from annoyance to fear. Ellen confided in Mrs. Wickham about Nicholas's unwanted advances. Frances, outraged on her behalf, confronted Nicholas privately and told him such behavior would not be tolerated. This intervention only fueled Nicholas's anger. He felt humiliated, first rejected by Ellen, now scolded by the lady of the house as if he were a misbehaving schoolboy. The other housemaid, Catherine Dowd, witnessed at least one tense exchange where Mrs. Wickham firmly ordered Nicholas to leave the women servants alone. Nicholas had stalked off, muttering under his breath. In Catherine's account later, she recalled Frances turning to Ellen afterward and reassuring her that she would be protected. Frances took her role as protector of the women in her employ seriously, and this likely infuriated Nicholas further. To his mind, the Wickhams were siding against him, a man of the house, because of a mere servant girl's whims. As winter turned to spring 1854, the atmosphere on the farm grew tense. Nicholas's resentment festered. He quarreled more often with the other workers. Once, when James gently corrected how Nicholas was handling a team of horses, Nicholas snapped and frightened the animals with a rough yank of the reins. James reprimanded him for being cruel to the horses, warning that such behavior was not acceptable. That scolding only deepened Nicholas's feelings of being disrespected. All the while, an undercurrent of anti-Irish sentiment in society may have grated on Nicholas's psyche. In 1854 America, Irish Catholic immigrants were often viewed with suspicion and contempt by the predominantly Protestant Yankee communities. Political movements like the Know Nothings preached nativism, and newspapers ran ugly screeds calling Irish arrivals locusts overrunning the land. Even on the North Fork, prejudice existed. Irish families had to purchase land for Catholic churches in secret to avoid local backlash. Nicholas likely experienced slights, perhaps sneers at his accent or derogatory names, whenever he went into town, an outsider who could never truly belong. To make matters worse, Nicholas had a dishonest streak alongside his temper. One day, Ellen discovered that $30, a significant sum she'd saved, perhaps hoping to send for family members back in Ireland, was missing from the trunk in her attic room. She was distraught and mentioned it to Frances, who suspected Nicholas almost immediately. There were rumors he had gambling debts, or at least a habit of spending too freely at taverns. There was little proof, but the suspicion hung in the air, straining trust further. It later emerged that Nicholas did indeed steal the money from Ellen's trunk, an act of petty vengeance or greed that he would all but admit to when confronted. The breaking point came on Sunday, May 28, 1854. In the afternoon, Frances enlisted Nicholas and one of the other workers to carry some feather mattresses outside for airing in the sunshine, a common chore as the weather warmed. According to accounts, as Nicholas wrestled a bulky mattress through a doorway, he deliberately shoved past Mrs. Wickham, knocking her hard into the wall. Frances, caught off guard, fell against a table and bruised her side badly. She cried out more from shock than pain as Nicholas stomped away without so much as an apology. It was unclear if he had done it intentionally or was simply being careless, but Frances firmly believed it was deliberate aggression. The demure, kind lady of the house had been physically assailed by her own servant. 55, 56, 55, 56, 58, 59, 60, 59, 61, 62, 64, 65. That evening, when James returned from a short trip to New York City, he periodically went back to tend to some business matters with his former firm. He found Frances shaken and sore. She recounted the entire litany of Nicholas's misdeeds, the harassment of Ellen, the suspected theft of money, and now this physical attack on her person. For James, this was beyond the pale. Protective fury rose in him. The Wickhams may have been genteel in many ways, but James was not one to let such outrages go unanswered. That night, he likely lay awake next to Frances, reassuring her in a low voice that come morning he would deal with Nicholas for good. Upstairs in the attic, Ellen and Catherine likely did not sleep much either, fearful of what Nicholas might do next. But Nicholas himself might have slumbered soundly in drunken oblivion, unaware that his days under the Wickham's roof were now numbered. Chapter 3, The Fateful Dismissal. On Monday morning, May 29, 1854, James Wickham rose with a clear objective. Nicholas Bahan must go. But he was a shrewd man. He knew Nicholas could be dangerous if provoked, so he prepared to handle the matter with both firmness and caution. He first rode into Cutchogue village to enlist the help of a friend as a witness. He chose William Betts, the storekeeper, who was known for his level head. Betts accompanied James back to the farm, both to serve as moral support and to make sure there was a third party present for whatever might unfold. They found Nicholas in the barn, pitchfork in hand as he tossed hay for the horses, perhaps still nursing a hangover from the day before. Standing in the dim, dusty barn doorway, James confronted his hired man. Frances's bruise, darkening on her ribs, was fresh in his mind. Betts hung back a few paces, arms crossed, watchful. James's voice was cold and steady. He told Nicholas that his behavior had been intolerable, disrespecting the mistress of the house, stealing from a fellow servant, and generally disrupting the peace of the farm. Nicholas, caught off guard, attempted denial and bluster. He dropped the pitchfork and protested loudly, "I've done nothing wrong. She's lying," perhaps referring to Ellen's complaints or Frances's account. James held up a hand to cut him off. With an authority that could not be ignored, he announced, "Mr. Behan, you are discharged from my service. You will leave this farm at once." The words echoed in the barn. For a second, Nicholas stood still, stunned. Then the reality hit. He was losing his job and home, his face contorted with rage and panic. He began pleading, then cursing, his mood swinging wildly as it often did. He begged James to reconsider. "I need this work, sir. I'll do better, I will." But almost in the same breath, he snarled, "You'll regret this, Wickham. Mark me, you will." Betts stepped forward, sensing potential violence. Nicholas's fists were clenching and unclenching at his sides. The farmhand was burly and could overpower the older James if it came to blows. James kept a safe distance, meeting Nicholas's eyes without flinching. He informed Nicholas that for the sake of decency, he would provide two things despite the man's misconduct: money for travel and settlement of his small debts in town. James reached into his coat and handed Nicholas $2, enough for a one-way train fare off the East End, perhaps to Brooklyn or beyond. Additionally, James had already taken care of a $10 tab Nicholas owed at Betts's general store, clearing it on Nicholas's behalf. This gesture was both generous and calculated. James did not want Nicholas lingering around claiming he was owed wages or unable to leave. With these provisions, Nicholas had no excuse to stay. "Your debt in the hamlet is paid and your fare is in hand," James said. "Now gather your belongings and go." 31, 66, 31, 67, 68, 68, Nicholas snatched the $2 with a sneer. In his mind, this was blood money for his humiliation. He likely felt no gratitude that his employer was doing more than required by law. Instead, Nicholas's pride was smarting. He might have spat on the barn floor in contempt, but seeing Betts and James both watching him cautiously, Betts with a hand near where a pistol might be holstered, Nicholas restrained himself from any physical outburst. He stomped off to the small servant's quarters to pack his trunk, muttering curses thick with his Irish brogue. It was around midday when Nicholas trudged down the lane from the Wickham farm with his trunk slung over his shoulder, like a defeated soldier retreating from battle. James and Betts watched from the porch to ensure he left without further incident. As Nicholas passed through the gate, he turned and shouted back something that made Frances, peering anxiously from an upstairs window, shiver. "I'll be back, you hear me? I'll have my revenge on ye, every last one of ye," he screamed, face red with fury. James ordered him to keep moving, and Betts took a few menacing steps forward, prompting Nicholas to think better of lingering. Casting one last hateful glare at the farmhouse, Nicholas hefted his trunk and continued on. True to his word, James had tried to send Nicholas away with minimal friction. He even advised the man where to go. The Long Island Railroad line ran out to Greenport at the eastern tip of the North Fork. From Cutchogue, Greenport Station was about 10 miles away, an easy train ride or a half-day walk westward. With the $2 fare, Nicholas could catch the next train to Brooklyn or Queens, and from there integrate into the anonymity of New York City, perhaps find work on the docks or in factories. James hoped, for everyone's sake, that Nicholas would simply disappear into the metropolis and never return. That Monday night, the Wickham household breathed a tentative sigh of relief. Catherine Dowd later said that the mood at supper was markedly lighter without Nicholas glowering at the table. Frances, while still nursing her bruise, was optimistic that the worst was behind them. She had taken steps to ensure the girl's safety and her own by urging James to act, and he had done so decisively. Over tea, Frances likely commended her husband's handling of the situation. James would have nodded, cautioning that Nicholas might cause some trouble in town, but was hopefully gone for good. Meanwhile, Ellen quietly offered prayers of thanks. She felt a weight lifted knowing Nicholas was off the farm. Little did any of them know their reprieve was dangerously premature. That night, Nicholas did not stray far. Instead of heading straight for a train out of town, he sought temporary shelter at the farm of William Wickham Sr., James's own father. The elder Wickham's farm was conveniently close, just a half-mile west along Main Road. William Sr., well into his 70s, still kept a few laborers of his own, including several Irish hands. Perhaps out of pity or not yet knowing the full extent of Nicholas's disgrace, the farmhands at William Sr.'s place let Nicholas spend the night in their bunkhouse. It was an act of camaraderie that, in hindsight, had deadly consequences by allowing Nicholas to linger in the area. One imagines Nicholas that night in the bunkhouse, seething silently among his countrymen, replaying the day's events, nursing his wounded pride and burgeoning anger. Maybe another Irish laborer passed him a flask of whiskey to calm his nerves. If so, it likely only stoked the fire inside him. He felt wronged by the girl who rejected him, by the mistress who scolded him, and above all, by James Wickham, who dared to send him away like a thief in the night, which, ironically, he was. The following morning, Tuesday, May 30th, word of the firing spread quietly through the hamlet. In an era without telephones or instant news, gossip traveled by whispers in the general store or over fences. The narrative likely varied depending on who told it. Some said Nicholas had tried to hurt Mrs. Wickham, others focused on him bothering the girls. Still others just called him a drunk who finally got what he deserved. 69-70-10 Nicholas, for his part, awoke in the bunkhouse with a pounding head and a heart full of bitterness. He was not planning to slink away meekly. Instead, he marched over to old William Wickham's door and brazenly asked the patriarch for help getting his job back. It was an audacious move, appealing to the father to overrule the son. William Sr., who knew of Nicholas's initial hiring but perhaps not all of his misconduct, turned him away. He likely told Nicholas that James was master of his own farm and that his decision stood. Thwarted again, Nicholas's desperation mounted. On Wednesday, May 31st, he decided to confront James directly one more time. That afternoon, he trudged back down the long lane of the Wickham farm, a sight that must have alarmed the family if they spied him coming. James met him in the yard. One imagines the farmer standing firm with sleeves rolled up, ready to assert his authority. Nicholas all but demanded to be rehired. He argued he'd been a good worker for 2 years, that whatever wrongs he'd done were minor, that they needed him. James refused flatly. Then Nicholas changed tack and demanded a horse from the farm, claiming he needed one for travel. Perhaps he thought James might lend or sell him a horse as part of his send-off. This James also refused, noting icily that Nicholas had been cruel to the horses in the past and he wouldn't subject any animal to that now. James probably also realized arming Nicholas with a fast means of transport was a terrible idea. During this tense exchange, Nicholas, in a moment of bravado or spite, admitted to stealing the $30 from Ellen's trunk. He might have smirked and said something like, I took the lass's money. And what of it? Consider it wages due. James was taken aback by the brazenness. This was effectively a confession to theft. James's face hardened. If there was any thought of leniency left, it vanished. He ordered Nicholas off his property once more, likely threatening that if he returned again, legal action would be taken. Nicholas left, but the confrontation had further fueled his rage. He had tried contrition, then ultimatum, now intimidation, and nothing got him what he wanted. The rejection festered into a singular obsession, revenge. That evening, he sullenly returned to William Sr.'s farm or its vicinity. His welcome among the Irish workers was wearing thin. They must have noticed his unstable behavior and perhaps feared being tarred by association. So Nicholas finally began to make concrete plans to leave the immediate area, but not in surrender, rather as a tactical retreat in preparation for vengeance. On Thursday, June 1st, accompanied by a fellow Irish acquaintance named McCarthy, Nicholas went back to the Wickham farm one last time. Not for confrontation, but to gather his remaining belongings. With stony silence, he retrieved a trunk he had left behind, likely containing clothes, maybe some personal tools or letters. This time, the Wickhams allowed it without incident. Perhaps James had instructed the servants to simply let him take his things and be done. As a final parting, Nicholas cast his dark gaze over the farmhouse, imprinting every detail in his memory. The trim garden Francis kept, the upstairs window of Ellen's attic room, the barn where he had toiled. The next time he came here, he thought, it wouldn't be to plead or pack. It would be for something far more sinister. Trunk in hand, Nicholas then enlisted another friend to help carry it to the Cutchogue train depot. This small station was just at the edge of the village, a whistle stop where steam trains chuffed in a couple of times a day en route to Greenport or back west toward New York. The friend who helped him, later identified in testimonies, noticed that Nicholas was disturbingly calm now. Nicholas spoke of leaving the North Fork, yet there was a glint in his eye that belied his outward composure. As they waited on the wooden platform for the afternoon train to Greenport, Nicholas couldn't hold his tongue, perhaps thinking 71, 72, 57, 73, 57, 58, 74, 75, 32, 3211 himself among confidants, or simply unable to contain his wrath. He voiced aloud the dark intent consuming him. He threatened, in explicit terms, to take revenge on Ellen Holland. "I intend to have me revenge on that girl," he growled to his companion. He spoke of ravishing Ellen Holland, rape her in plain language, and then hinted at doing further violence to those who had crossed him. The friend was alarmed enough that he later reported worthies to investigators. Nicholas said in so many words that he intended to ravish Ellen Holland. It was a chilling pronouncement, revealing that his primary target was not just James or Francis, but Ellen, the woman at the heart of his wounded pride. The farmhand blamed the servant girl's rejection for the cascade of events that cost him his job and dignity, and he fixated on punishing her in the most brutal way imaginable before also settling the score with the Wickhams. The train whistle blew, and the locomotive rumbled in. If Nicholas boarded with his trunk, as appearances suggested, that could have been the end of the matter on Long Island soil. But Nicholas had deception in mind. He did a cunning thing. He checked his trunk at the station, likely under the pretense that he'd come back for it, and did not get on the train. Perhaps he feigned a goodbye to his friend as if he were waiting for the next one. Or maybe he slunk away when others were distracted by the arrival. The key is that by day's end on June 1st, Nicholas had planted false evidence of his departure, his luggage bound ostensibly for Greenport and beyond, while he himself remained in the vicinity, skulking and plotting. Indeed, Nicholas made his way to Greenport, but not via the train. He likely walked or hitched a ride separately. In Greenport, a bustling harbor village where he could blend in, he rented a cheap room at a boarding house run by the Connor family. He even found a short-term job at the local brickyards in an area called Hashamomuk, demonstrating a semblance of moving on. For a couple of days he maintained this facade, but those who observed him noted he was a man seething with resentment. He spent his evenings brooding, perhaps sharpening a small pocket knife and replaying fantasies of violence. He had told people he was leaving, but every fiber of his being was pulled back to that farmhouse on the Cutchogue Lane. As June 2nd, 1854, dawned, the Friday that would end in blood, Nicholas Behan was still in Greenport, biding his time. That day, he went through normal motions at the brickyard, lifting heavy molds and stacking fresh bricks under the summer sun. But his mind was elsewhere. He had already decided that the coming night would be the night. He had unfinished business to settle back at the Wickham farm, and he now had the element of surprise on his side. He had allowed enough time for the Wickhams and the servants to think he was truly gone. By slipping away from the boarding house under cover of darkness, he could travel the 10 miles back to Cutchogue covertly. Nicholas spent part of that afternoon methodically assembling what he would need. He procured a weapon and tools to carry with him, not the murder weapon itself that he knew he could find on the farm, but backup. From a local contact, or perhaps purchased in town, Nicholas had a single-barrel pistol, which he loaded with small lead shot and tucked into his coat pocket. He also carried a straight razor, not uncommon as a personal item in those days, but given the way he would later use it, it was likely part of a grim contingency plan. Additionally, he packed some provisions, bread and cake, enough food for a couple of days on the run. Nicholas knew that after what he intended to do, he would need to flee and hide. This was no crime of passion without foresight. It was premeditated to a chilling degree. He even considered his escape routes. His initial thought, as he'd confided in his confession, was to head off Long Island entirely, take a ferry across Long Island Sound to Connecticut, then a train to New York City. Alternatively, he might try to slip onto a westbound train along the island's spine. 76, 77, 76, 76, 78, 79, 81, 882, 83, 782, 84, 85, 86, 87, 812. But first, revenge. As twilight fell on June 2nd, Nicholas finished a meager supper at the boarding house, then quietly slipped out. He did not bid goodbye. He left his rented room key on a table, perhaps, and simply vanished into the night. Some accounts say he followed the railroad tracks for part of the journey back west, using them as a guide through the woods. One can imagine him moving under the cover of darkness, that long, purposeful stride eating up the miles. The sounds of the night, crickets, distant waves on the shore were all oblivious to the deadly errand of this lone figure. Around him, the gently rolling land of vineyards and farms that looked so inviting by day became an inky labyrinth. Nicholas likely arrived on the outskirts of Cutchogue near midnight. The village was silent. Kerosene street lamps glowed faintly at intervals, and nearly every home was dark and asleep. He avoided the main road and approached the Wickham property from a side path he knew well, perhaps cutting through a neighbor's orchard or along the edge of a marsh to come up from the rear. Clouds drifted across the waning moon, giving intermittent light. Nicholas paused at the boundary of the farm, crouching behind a hedgerow to observe. The house was completely dark, every lamp extinguished. It was late. The household surely had gone to bed thinking it a night like any other. In the yard, the only movements were the soft rustle of leaves and the restless shuffle of horses in the barn. A dog slept somewhere inside. He was the Wickham's loyal watchdog, but Nicholas knew that creature intimately. It was the same dog he'd fed scraps to and played with when he lived here. The dog knew his scent and wouldn't raise alarm if he entered. That gave Nicholas confidence. He steeled himself, going over the plan one last time. Enter quietly, kill the boy first, the only male who could pose resistance. Then move on to the couple, and finally find Ellen. Ellen was the prize of his revenge. He wanted her alive initially, to violate and terrorize as payback for humiliating him. Only afterward would he kill her too, in his original conception. For this monstrous plan, he needed a more formidable weapon than a pocket pistol or razor. But that was no issue, because he knew precisely where to get one on the farm. The Wickhams owned a well-equipped barn full of farming tools. By feel and memory, Nicholas slipped into the barn's shadowy interior. Hanging on the wall or propped in a corner would be exactly what he sought: a pole axe, also known as a mortising axe. This was a long-handled axe with a narrow blade designed for cutting precise holes in timber and fence posts. It was somewhat smaller than a typical felling axe, but every bit as lethal in capable hands. Nicholas's hands were more than capable. They were shaking slightly now, but not with fear, with anticipation. His fingers closed around the wooden handle of the pole axe. He hefted it. The weight was good. The iron head had a sharp, chisel-like blade on one side. This very tool had been in his grasp many times during honest work, chopping and notching wood. Tonight, it would taste blood. Nicholas stepped out of the barn armed, a dark silhouette against the even darker sky. He crept towards the farmhouse. The front door was likely locked at this hour, but Nicholas knew another way in. The kitchen window on the east side was often left unlocked. It was how pies cooled on the sill, how the maids might slip out to toss dishwater. He also knew that on the kitchen floor slept the dog. But as expected, when he eased the window open with the silent care of a burglar, the dog merely lifted its head and sniffed. The animal's tail might even have thumped in faint recognition. The scent was familiar. It was old Nicholas, a member of the household pack until recently. So the dog did not bark or growl. Perhaps it whined softly in confusion, but Nicholas tossed it a bit of bread from his pocket and shushed it. The hound padded away to a corner, appeased for the moment. 89, 90, 89, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 13. Now Nicholas was inside the house. In the faint glow from the kitchen's banked embers, his figure was hunched and menacing, the long axe in hand. He knew the layout blindfolded. A short hall led from the kitchen to the rest of the ground floor. There was a back stair that ascended to the small bedroom where young Stephen slept. Nicholas moved with deliberate, soft steps to those servant stairs, ascending toward the boy's quarters first. The house was silent, save for the ticking of a mantel clock somewhere and the muffled snoring of someone above. Perhaps Nicholas held his breath so as not to make a sound. Upstairs he went, emerging into the cramped space under the eaves where Stephen lay on a cot, completely unaware of the doom creeping toward him. A lamplight from outside, or maybe the moon between clouds, cast just enough glow for Nicholas to see the outline of the sleeping boy. Stephen Winston, about 14 years old, was one of the more vulnerable members of the household. He was an African-American youth, possibly an orphan taken in for work. A life that was hard, but at least offered some shelter. On this night, he slept deeply, perhaps exhausted from helping with farm chores all day. Stephen would never wake before the axe came down. Nicholas struck with merciless force, bringing the pole axe blade down onto Stephen's head. The first blow sank into the skull with a sickening thud, instantly shattering bone. Stephen might have spasmed or reflexively tried to move, but Nicholas struck again and again, ensuring the boy was incapacitated. Blood splattered across the small room, spraying the low ceiling in Nicholas's hands as it ran down the axe handle. The carnage was swift and silent. Stephen did not even have time to scream. He was left sprawled, critically wounded, but miraculously clinging to life by a thread. With the boy neutralized, Nicholas's plan moved to the next phase. He descended a few steps back to the door that separated the kitchen wing from the main part of the second floor, the threshold that led to the Wickham's living quarters. As he opened that door, the creak alerted Frances Wickham, who had perhaps been stirring in her sleep or had heard some muffled thumps. She appeared suddenly in the hallway, likely in her nightgown, a lamp in one hand. The soft light illuminated a ghastly sight. Nicholas, disheveled and wild-eyed, his hands and forearms already slick with blood, an axe dripping red in his grip. It must have looked like a vision from hell itself. Frances gasped, heart leaping into her throat. Yet despite the shock, Frances's first instinct was not to scream, but to reason. Perhaps she thought this was a burglary and that he wanted money or valuables. "Nicholas, please, take what you want and leave," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling but clear. She positioned herself as a barrier between Nicholas and the rest of the house, desperate to protect her husband asleep in the next room. Her words came out in a rush. "Take anything in the house, but don't harm us." In that moment, Frances's courage shone. Face to face with the man who had hurt her and threatened her household, she still tried to appeal to his humanity. Nicholas answered by shoving Frances backward, forcing his way fully into the upstairs hallway. The commotion roused James Wickham from the bedroom. James hurried out to the hall wearing his nightshirt, bewildered but ready to defend his wife. The beam of Frances's lamp fell upon the intruder's visage, and James's eyes widened in recognition and disbelief. Nicholas, the dismissed farmhand, had returned under cover of darkness with an axe and murder in his eyes. Before James could react further, Nicholas lunged. With surprising might, he barged into both James and Frances, driving them back into their bedroom. Perhaps he knew keeping them confined in one space gave him the advantage. James grappled with Nicholas, trying to disarm him or at least stall the attack. He was 10 or more years older and not as strong, but adrenaline fueled him. The two men struggled near the foot 98-99, 100, 101, 100, 102, 104, 105, 104, 14 of the bed, knocking over a side table and sending a porcelain water basin crashing to the floor. Frances, now screaming, tried to pull Nicholas off her husband, pounding at his back with her fists. Nicholas snarled and swung the axe, catching James on the side of the head with a glancing but brutal blow. James crumpled to the floorboards, stunned and bleeding profusely from a gash that split his scalp. That's when Francis's screams reached their peak. "Nicholas, don't kill him! Don't kill him!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as sheer panic set in. In her desperation, she repeated it, begging, "Don't kill him! Take what you want in the house, but don't kill him!" The plea echoed through the house, certainly heard by the others upstairs. In Francis's mind, if there was a shred of mercy in Nicholas, perhaps he would stop at robbery or vengeance short of murder. She was wrong. Her words barely left her lips when Nicholas raised the axe and brought it down repeatedly on James Wickham, who lay dazed on the floor. Thwack, thwack! The sound of metal biting into flesh and bone is a terrible, heavy sound, more muffled than a hammer on wood, more horrible than one can imagine. Nicholas struck James again and again with unbridled fury. James's body convulsed with each hit, blood splashing upward onto the walls, across the bed linens, everywhere. It was a frenzy of violence, driven by every ounce of hatred Nicholas felt toward this man who had fired and humiliated him. Francis was beyond terror. She could not physically stop the onslaught on her husband, and with each blow, she knew James was closer to death. In a blind instinct for survival, Francis turned and made for the window. The bedroom's corner window was possibly open to the warm night air. If she could jump out onto the porch roof, she might survive or at least call for help. But Nicholas was not going to lose a victim. As Francis scrambled to climb out, Nicholas grabbed her by the hair or arm and dragged her forcibly back into the room. She fought, nails scratching at his bloody arms, but he was far stronger. In one swift motion, he hurled her onto the floor beside her husband's limp, moaning form. Without hesitation, Nicholas took the bloodied axe and delivered two powerful blows to Francis Wickham's head. He put such ferocity into those swings that the sharp blade shattered her skull, cracking it open like an eggshell. Fragments of bone and brain matter were cast across the room by the force of the impact, spewed around the floor, and even onto the nearby wall. Francis likely died instantly, mercifully spared any further suffering. Upstairs in the attic, Ellen Holland and Catherine Dowd heard the entire appalling episode unfold beneath them. Awakened by Francis's initial scream, they had pressed their ears to the floorboards or perhaps cracked open their attic door. They could make out Francis's voice begging, then the sickening sounds of blows, and then silence from Mrs. Wickham. They knew Nicholas's voice and must have realized in horror that he had returned to wreak his revenge. In that moment, Ellen understood that Nicholas had come for her as well. She was next if she didn't escape. Catherine acted first. Heart hammering, she threw open the attic window that overlooked the kitchen wing roof. Catherine was nimble and in her early 20s. She climbed out, lowering herself onto the sloping roof of the kitchen addition. From there, she leapt to the roof of the milk house a few feet below and finally down to the ground. She landed hard, twisting an ankle, but fear propelled her to limp run into the darkness, heading up the lane toward Main Road. Behind her, Ellen followed suit. She, too, squeezed out the attic window, carefully dropping onto the lower roof and descending. Just as Ellen's feet hit the ground, the attic door burst open. Nicholas had finished in the bedroom and heard some scuffling or detected movement upstairs. But when he poked his head and axe into the attic space, it was empty. The window stood open, the chilly night breeze wafting in. Realizing his quarry had fled, Nicholas let out a growl of frustration. He rushed to the window and saw, in the faint distance of the starlight, the figures of the two women retreating across the yard toward the lane. He cursed. Nicholas knew the terrain. If he tried to chase them now and failed to catch them quickly, they would alert neighbors, and his time would be up. Instead, he decided to cut his losses and run. He had done most of what he came to do. James and Francis lay butchered, and Stephen was left for dead. Ellen had escaped his immediate clutches, but in his deranged mind perhaps he thought the death of her protectors was punishment enough, or that he might get another chance at her later. But now, with the women fleeing to raise an alarm, the clock was ticking for him to vanish. Nicholas hurried back through the house, blood-soaked axe still in hand. He snatched a few odd valuables in a last-minute sweep, maybe Francis's silk purse from a side table or James's gold pocket watch. though this was likely just an afterthought if it happened at all. Approaching a second-story window at the rear of the house, not the same one he had entered through, he slung one leg over the sill. With surprising agility for a man of his size, Nicholas lowered himself and dropped to the ground below. The fall was about 12 feet. He landed with a thud, perhaps rolling to absorb impact. In his haste, he left the axe behind, either dropping it on the ground where he landed or tossing it aside so it wouldn't hinder his flight. The murder weapon, coated in gore, gleamed dully in the moonlight on the dew-wet grass. Nicholas took off into the night, disappearing just minutes before Betts, Corwin, and Dr. Carpenter would arrive at the scene, alerted by Catherine and Ellen's desperate cries for help. He was gone into the darkness, retreating toward the woods and swamps he knew could hide him. The devil had done his work in the cornfield and the farmhouse, leaving behind death and despair. But the aftermath of his rampage was only beginning, and the largest manhunt in the town's history was about to erupt with a furious zeal to capture the man who had brought hell to Cutchogue. The Wickham farmhouse bedroom, modern photograph, where James and Frances Wickham were murdered in 1854. This second-floor room became the scene of unspeakable horror on the night of June 2, 1854, when Nicholas Behan attacked the sleeping couple with an axe. Chapter 4. Manhunt at Daybreak. Chaos reigned in the aftermath of the murders as the quiet hamlet of Cutchogue awoke to its worst nightmare. The sun had not yet risen on Saturday, June 3, 1854, but the alarm was spreading rapidly. Catherine Dowd had run half barefoot up the lane to William Betts's house and pounded on the door, screaming that the Wickhams were being murdered. Ellen, right behind her, then darted to another neighbor, Joseph Corwin. Their frantic warnings mobilized the men who then rushed to the farm, as described in Chapter 1. Now, with Nicholas vanished into the darkness, the priority shifted to finding and capturing the killer before he could escape entirely or hurt someone else. Within an hour of the discovery of the crime, hundreds of townspeople were roused and gathering at the Wickham property or fanning out in search parties. Word spread like wildfire down Main Road and into neighboring hamlets. Murder. The Wickhams have been butchered. The sheer brutality made even the reticent speak up. By dawn, people from as far as Southold and Mattituck had heard rumors, and some were on their way to assist. Southold town hadn't seen a homicide in 30 years, and this double murder, with a 120, 119, 120, 21, 77, 17, 122, 123, 12, 124, possible third victim in Stephen fighting for his life, was enough to cause the town's inhabitants to erupt in fury, as one account noted. Men armed themselves with whatever weapons they owned: muskets from the militia, hunting rifles, pistols, swords passed down from the Revolution, even axes and scythes. The community's beloved patriarch and matriarch had been slain in their own home, and folks were determined to get justice immediately. Many openly shouted that they'd hang Nicholas on the spot if they found him. The outrage was tinged with personal grief. Everyone knew and liked the Wickhams. Some of the searchers had been childhood friends of James or recipients of Frances's charity. Now their blood was on the ground of a home considered almost sacred in local memory. The search operation quickly organized along logical lines. Possessive townsmen spread out to scour the surrounding area. One group took to the farm fields and orchards near the Wickham house. Another moved toward the woods and low hills to the north and east, while others rode on horseback along the roads to set up a vigilante perimeter. They were convinced Nicholas couldn't have gone far on foot. They also looked for any sign of him: broken twigs, footprints, blood trails. Indeed, near the farmhouse, one party found a set of bloody boot prints leading away into a marshy part of the woods. The prints were notably large, consistent with Nicholas's known heavy boots, which reassured them they were on the right track. But soon those tracks were lost in the tangle of swamp and brush. The early light of dawn saw a surreal scene. Houses lit up one by one along the roads, and figures with lanterns moving in lines through the misty fields. Women and children huddled in doorways, fearfully whispering prayers that the killer wouldn't sneak up on them. Some families, learning that Nicholas was the murderer, likely double-checked their locks, A few Irish laborers in the area might have worried if the angry mobs would cast suspicion on them by association. It was a tense morning, a community on edge and baying for blood. Meanwhile, back at the Wickham farm, a more somber task unfolded. A few men had stayed behind to guard the scene and tend to the victims. Dr. Carpenter and another physician from a nearby village did what they could. It was too late for James and Francis. They were carefully moved to a downstairs room, covered respectfully with sheets. The doctor officially pronounced Francis dead at about 2 a.m., and James expired not long after, perhaps around 2:30 a.m. Little Stephen Winston was clinging to life by a thread. The doctors managed to stabilize him just enough to move him to a neighbor's house, which they'd improvised as a field hospital. Stephen's ear was severed and his skull badly fractured. One doctor murmured it was a miracle the boy was still breathing at all. They cleaned his wounds and wrapped his head tightly, hoping to prevent infection. Every so often, one of the doctors would come by the Wickham house to check on him and report to others. Astonishingly, Stephen survived his injuries in the short term, although his condition remained critical and he was unconscious. He would survive to testify later, making Nicholas's crime legally an assault for Stephen rather than a murder, which is likely why history counts 2 murders, not 3. At first light, local authorities began to coordinate with the citizens. The South Old Town sheriff, a man named Sheriff Isaiah Howard, rode in from the nearby town seat. He was confronted with a volatile situation, armed mobs combing the countryside and emotions running extremely high. Sheriff Howard knew he had to impose some order or risk vigilante chaos. He deputized several trustworthy men on the spot and tasked them with preventing any rash actions like burning down suspect houses or harming innocents. However, in this case, the mob's target was singular and definite: Nicholas Behan. There was no 12, 125, 12, 126, 14, 15, 13, 127, 128, 10, 11, 129, 7 doubt or mystery. The entire community knew who they were after, thanks to the direct eyewitness accounts and evidence. Throughout Saturday, the search continued intensely. They nearly caught Nicholas at one point that day. According to later reports, Nicholas had approached the home of an Irish acquaintance named John Thompson, or another friend in the area, on Saturday for shelter and food. Perhaps he assumed a fellow countryman might hide him out of solidarity. But news travels fast. This acquaintance was already aware Nicholas was a wanted man for heinous crimes. The moment Nicholas let slip into the house, Thompson attempted to detain him, maybe by suddenly grabbing his arm or slamming a door to trap him. Nicholas, wiry and desperate, wriggled free and dashed out before the search party that wasn't far behind could arrive. This narrow escape galvanized the pursuers. They knew he was close by and on foot. Nicholas then changed tactics and direction, realizing Greenport, to the east, might be swarming with searchers and the dock watched. He moved westward toward an area called Hashamomuck Pond, and beyond that toward the hamlet of Peconic, which was known as Hermitage back then. This region had swampy terrain by the Peconic River's inlet and plenty of dense thickets, ideal for hiding. He likely laid low on Sunday, June 4th, as the hunt raged around him. Searchers went through woods calling his name. Dogs were possibly brought in to track his scent, but they didn't find him that day. One can imagine Nicholas during these 2 days, exhausted, mosquito-bitten, drenched from crouching in marsh water. He would have been hungry after finishing whatever bread and cake he carried. Perhaps he dared to sip from stagnant pools or creeks to stay hydrated. All the while, the shouts of searchers or the distant crack of a firearm, men firing in the air to signal or out of frustration, reminded him that thousands wanted him dead. He might have thought about surrendering, but likely knew that the chance of a lynching was high if he did. By Monday, June 5th, Nicholas had been evading capture for 3 nights. His luck and strength were running out. Hidden in a particularly swampy patch in Peconic, submerged up to his chest in water among reeds, he grew delirious. He must have realized he couldn't run forever. At some point in those dark hours, Nicholas decided on suicide rather than facing a vengeful mob or the hangman. From the razor case in his pocket, he retrieved his straight razor. With a trembling hand, he pressed it to his own throat and slashed, attempting to cut deep into the neck. But perhaps due to hesitation or pure bad luck, the wound he inflicted was not immediately fatal. It was a 2-inch wound on his throat. It bled, certainly, and would have been painful, but it missed the major arteries. Some speculate he lost his nerve mid-slice and stopped short. He threw the razor away into the bog, either in frustration or because it slipped from his weakening grasp. It was ironically around this same morning that the community paused to hold the funeral for James and Frances Wickham. Monday, June 5th, had been set for their burial, as it was custom not to delay such rites long in those days. A huge crowd, reportedly hundreds of people, many from far away, gathered under a large willow tree behind the Wickham Farmhouse for the service. The Long Island Railroad even ran a special train to Cutchogue to bring mourners from other towns. Grief hung heavy in the summer air as the coffins lay side by side, draped perhaps with black cloth. A minister spoke solemn words about the beloved couple and the shock of their violent end, though likely avoiding graphic details. Neighbors and family wept openly. Among them was William Wickham, Jr., James's brother and district attorney of Suffolk County, who must have been torn between personal sorrow and professional indignation that his own brother's murderer was still at large. Also present, quietly in the rear, might have 14, 15, 130, 131, 130, 130, 131, 132, 33, 86, 134, 84, 85, 135, 136, 135, 137, 139, 138, 138, 141. 18 been Ellen Holland, perhaps supported by friends. How her heart must have ached with guilt and sadness. She'd lost her kindly employers and possibly felt it was because of her that Nicholas's wrath was unleashed. As the funeral proceeded, search parties were still at work, not far away. Some likely peeled off from hunting to attend the service, then returned to the pursuit. The funeral cortege after the service was itself an astonishing sight. A procession 2 miles long followed the wagons bearing the caskets to Mattituck Presbyterian Church, where the Wickhams were to be interred in the family plot. That was practically the whole town turning out, lining the roads in mournful homage. Few could recall any death being so widely commemorated on the East End. During that funeral, as fate would have it, the hunt finally struck gold. In the swampy thicket of Peconic, 2 local men, John Jones and John Jacobs, were trudging through knee-deep water, prodding with sticks, when one of them nearly stumbled over what looked like a pile of rags half submerged. It was Nicholas, collapsed in a foot of water, weak from blood loss due to his self-inflicted wound. The cut on his throat had clotted, but left him woozy and visibly injured. He was conscious, but barely, probably suffering from exposure as well. Upon being discovered, Nicholas might have made a half-hearted attempt to get up or reach for his pistol, but he was far too drained. Jones and Jacobs pounced on him, wresting away a loaded 1-shot pistol from his pocket, along with a folding knife and the empty razor case. They also noted the provisions he carried, soggy bread and cake, and saw that the bottoms of his pants were soaked with the blood of his victims, still staining him days later. One of the captors fired his own pistol in the air to signal the nearby search teams. That shot was heard all the way back in Cutchogue at the funeral. People initially panicked at the sound, but when word swiftly arrived that Nicholas Bain had been captured, a wave of emotion surged. Cheers from some, sobs of relief from others. The manhunt that had terrorized and galvanized the community was over. However, a new danger emerged, the possibility of mob justice. When Jones and Jacobs dragged Nicholas out of the swamp, a throng of enraged townsmen descended upon them almost immediately. They found a wretched figure. Nicholas's skin was pallid, scratched from brambles, caked in mud. His throat bore the fresh bloody gash of his suicide attempt. The sight did not inspire pity. Rather, it was like waving red to bulls. People screamed curses, "Hang the devil now," "murdering bastard," and far uglier slurs, some targeting his Irish heritage. Several men lunged to grab Nicholas from his captors. Hold, fists raised to beat him, or ropes ready to string him up on the nearest tree. Sheriff Howard, who had been racing to the scene on horseback, arrived at this critical juncture. Drawing his pistol, he interposed himself between Nicholas and the mob. He barked at the crowd to stand down, invoking the law. It took considerable courage, The mob was in a frenzy and could have easily overrun one sheriff. But a few cooler heads among the citizens helped him, pleading, "Let the law hang him properly. Don't become murderers yourselves." The sheriff and his hastily deputized aides got a firm grip on Nicholas, hustling him onto a wagon or horse for transport. The mass of people seethed around them, but parted enough when the sheriff leveled his gun and shouted that he'd shoot the first man who interfered. Thus, Nicholas Behan was saved from lynching by the rule of law, albeit narrowly. The crowd, still spewing insults and threats, followed en masse as the sheriff conveyed the prisoner to the Suffolk County Jail in Riverhead, about 20 miles west. It was described as a band of thousands of men and boys. 142, 143, 144, 145, 144, 135, 146, 135, 147, 149, 135, 146, 150, 151, 151, 152, untrailing behind. A staggering figure that underscores how the whole region was invested in this drama. Many in that mob clearly intended to see Nicholas hang one way or another. If not extrajudicially, then they would attend his formal execution with glee. The sheriff must have ridden hard, the wagon wheels clattering, trying to outpace the angry procession. By the time they reached the jail in Riverhead, the day was waning. The Suffolk County Jail was a stout brick building with a walled courtyard. The sheriff got Nicholas inside under guard, then faced the mob outside. They clamored at the gates, some demanding to finish the job. At this point, perhaps some local militia or extra deputies were called in to disperse the throng, assuring them that Nicholas would face swift and certain justice in court. Safely behind bars, Nicholas collapsed on a cot. His throat was bandaged by a jailhouse doctor and his other minor injuries treated. It's reported that as soon as he was stabilized, Nicholas confessed to all 3 murders, believing Stephen had died. Perhaps he thought owning up might spare him a torturous trial, or maybe he was simply beyond resistance. He gave details aligning with what was already known, including his intent to rape Ellen and kill the Wickhams out of revenge. He also recounted his aborted escape plan, first trying for the New London ferry but seeing too many people at the dock, then failing to hop a train west, which drove him into the swamps as a last resort. This confession, recorded by a New York Times reporter on June 7, 1854, removed any lingering doubt and sealed his fate. With Nicholas in custody, the immediate fear in Cutchogue dissipated. People no longer had to bolt their doors in terror of a lurking madman, but the trauma remained. Neighbors spoke of nightmares and children who couldn't sleep for fear that Nicholas the Bogeyman would return. Indeed, the story of that night would become fireside lore for generations, a boogeyman tale too real for comfort. In the short term, though, focus shifted to the judicial process, ensuring that Nicholas Behan would meet a punishment fitting his monstrous deeds. Chapter 5. The Wheels of Justice. The machinery of justice in 1854 moved faster than one might expect, propelled by public outrage and the simplicity of the case. Still, due process had to be observed, especially with such a high-profile crime. The Suffolk County Court scheduled Nicholas Behan's trial for the fall of that year, giving a few months for preparation. In the meantime, Nicholas sat in the Riverhead jail, under heavy guard, to forestall any mob infiltration, and likely in solitary confinement for his own safety. He was a prisoner both hated and morbidly famous. Charles Dickens even took note of the case from across the ocean, commenting on it in his periodical household narrative of current events. It's not every day the likes of Dickens remark on a Long Island axe murder, indicating how far news of this sensational crime spread. Nicholas's family, if he had any close by, did not, so far as records show, mount any public defense or pleas for mercy. This was not an era of drawn-out investigations or complex legal maneuvering in clear-cut murder cases. However, Suffolk County faced one complication. James Wickham's brother, William Wickham Jr., was the county district attorney. Obviously, he could not prosecute the case of his own brother's murder due to conflict of interest and personal devastation. So the state brought in a heavy hitter. Ogden Hoffman, the Attorney General of New York State, was appointed as special prosecutor. That in itself was extraordinary and showed the gravity of the matter. For the defense, the court assigned a Riverhead lawyer named Spicer Dayton to represent Nicholas. Defending an admitted 150, 151, 153, 154, 155, 156, 87, 88, 157, 158, 159, 24, 160, 24, 161, 24, 162, 20 axe murderer reviled by the public was not a task any attorney would envy, but the system required that Nicholas have counsel. The trial opened in early October 1854 at the Suffolk County Courthouse in Riverhead. From the outset, it had the air of a formality. Everyone expected a conviction. Yet it was conducted with all proper decorum. Crowds packed the courtroom. It was a spectacle as much as a proceeding. Ladies in bonnets and gentlemen in town suits filled the gallery, and many had to be turned away at the doors. The local press and even some New York City newspapers had reporters on hand, their quills ready to scribble down every lurid detail for eager readers. Nicholas was led in under guard, shackled. Observers noted he looked pale and surprisingly calm. The ragged, muddy fugitive they had captured was cleaned up in a plain prison suit, though the healing cut on his neck was still visible above the collar. He showed little emotion, maintaining a stony, blank expression most of the time. When asked for his plea, Nicholas answered in a low voice, "Not guilty." It was a mere formality, given his confession outside of court and the evidence, but the trial would proceed to prove the charges of murder in the first degree. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. Attorney General Hoffman, an experienced and perhaps theatrical figure, presented the narrative of the crime from start to finish. Witnesses were called in a steady stream, painting a devastating picture. Catherine Dow took the stand, voice quavering as she described Nicholas's harassment of the servant girls, the events of the night, and her escape out the window. She repeated the chilling words she'd heard Frances cry, "Nicholas, don't kill him," which moved many in the courtroom to tears and hardened their hearts against the defendant. Catherine likely pointed to Nicholas when asked if she saw the man who committed these acts, and her finger did not waver. Ellen Holland testified as well, though it must have been an ordeal. She recounted Nicholas's marriage proposal, her rejection, and his subsequent threats and theft of her money. She spoke of how Mrs. Wickham defended her and the series of confrontations leading to Nicholas's firing. Then, with great emotion, she told the court of the night of June 2nd, hearing Mrs. Wickham's screams and pleas, the sounds of blows, and her flight for her life with Catherine. At one point, prosecutors carefully asked if Nicholas had ever threatened her specifically. Likely she relayed the friend's account of Nicholas vowing to ravish her in revenge, as that friend also testified to hearing those very words at the depot. Joseph Corwin, William Betts, and Dr. Carpenter recounted what they found at the scene. The grievously wounded Stephen, the slain Wickhams with the brutal injuries. Francis's shattered skull was described from the doctor's report in clinical but horrifying detail. The bloody footprints and Nicholas's dropped hat as incontrovertible evidence of his presence. John Jones and John Jacobs proudly detailed the capture in the swamp, producing the items taken from Nicholas's pockets, the pistol, knife, and razor case. They described Nicholas's failed suicide attempt, pointing to the scar on his throat as proof of guilt-driven desperation. Possibly Sheriff Howard or another official read aloud Nicholas's signed confession, given after capture. In it, Nicholas admitted to attacking Stephen first, then murdering James and Francis, and that his intent 108, 163, 164, 165, 166, 76, 77, 7, 167, 3168, 135, 146, 21 was to kill them and rape Ellen. Hearing this likely caused a ripple of disgusted gasps in the courtroom, especially from Victorian-era ladies unaccustomed to such blunt talk of ravishment. The defense had little to work with. Spicer Dayton might have tried an insanity defense, as was sometimes attempted in those days for shocking crimes. If he did, it would have required convincing the jury that Nicholas was not in his right mind, a hard sell given the evident premeditation, traveling back, arming, etc. More likely, the defense's strategy was simply to ensure the trial met legal standards, to avoid any chance of appeal, and perhaps to spare Nicholas the death penalty by some faint hope of mercy. However, considering the law and the era, clemency was not on the table. Two deliberate murders with an axe nearly always meant the gallows. One curious note: because this case had such notoriety, it's possible the defense hardly cross-examined some witnesses, not wanting to traumatize them further or anger the jury. Perhaps the only angle they stressed was that Nicholas had confessed and shown some remorse by attempting suicide, but that could just as easily be seen as cowardice rather than remorse. The jury of local men, no women jurors in those days, took very little time to deliberate. The evidence was overwhelming. They returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of James and Francis Wickham, and likely assault with intent to kill for Stephen's case, though the murder counts themselves were enough. Nicholas Behan was thus convicted, as everyone expected. When the judge asked Nicholas if he had anything to say before sentencing, accounts differ on his response. He might have muttered a simple apology or nothing at all. In some later retellings, murderers give dramatic speeches, but there's no record of a dramatic statement from Nicholas. Given his earlier confession, he might have been resigned. The judge then donned the black cap, as was tradition for pronouncing death sentences, and condemned Nicholas Behan to death by hanging. The execution date was set for December 15, 1854. In New York at that time, executions were carried out at the county level, often publicly. Suffolk County had a gallows apparatus. In fact, the local historical society had a model of the counterweight gallows used. The Wickham murders ensured that interest in this execution would be sky high. In the weeks leading to the execution, Nicholas remained in the Riverhead jail. There were reports that he spent his time carving something on the wall of his cell. Supposedly, he scratched his own name and the date of execution, as if marking his own tombstone. Nicholas Behan, executed December 15, 1854. Perhaps that was his way of confronting fate or leaving a final mark. Back in Cutchogue in the North Fork, life tried to return to normal. The winter came, frost coating the fields where corn had grown tall just months before, but reminders of the tragedy were everywhere. Ellen Holland, who had lost both employers and her sense of security, moved away for a time. She eventually married a fellow Irish immigrant, Daniel Haggerty, and settled again in Cutchogue on a new farm, raising a family. She even named one of her daughters Frances, perhaps in honor of Mrs. Wickham. Yet tellingly, when Ellen died decades later in 1901, obituaries did not mention her role in the Wickham saga. It was as if she and the community wished to let those ghosts rest. Stephen Winston recovered slowly from his wounds. There's scant record of his later life, but it seems he survived the ordeal. As for the Wickham farm, due to Francis dying first, even if only minutes before James, 155, 156, 152, 151, 169, 170, 171, 172, 173, 174, 175, 176, 177, 176, 178, 179, 180. 26th, the property remained in the Wickham family line rather than passing to Francis' post-relatives. So the farm continued to be worked by James's kin, preserving the Wickham presence on that land, which endures to this day. Newspapers far and wide commented on the case, often with sensational flair. Some decried the brutality of the act. Others took the opportunity to rail against the dangerous classes of immigrants, an unfortunate spasm of nativism sparked by the fact the criminal was Irish. But others saw in it a story of good and evil on a biblical scale, a peaceful, God-fearing community beset by one man's personal demons and vengeance. One 19th century writer opined that murders like this were momentary descents of God into an otherwise ordinary world, events people would talk about for years with a mix of horror and dark fascination. Certainly the Wickham murders lived on in local lore for generations, sometimes embellished, sometimes shrouded in a ghost story's cloak. But before it could pass fully into lore, there was one final chapter to enact: the public execution of Nicholas Behan, which many saw as the concluding justice and perhaps a grim form of closure for what had happened on that summer night. Chapter 6: The Hanging Crowd. The morning of December 5, 1854, dawned cold and gray over Riverhead. Despite the chill, an estimated 3,000 people gathered in the town by midday, making it possibly the largest crowd to ever assemble in Suffolk County up to that time. They had come from all across the East End, and some even from New York City by train or stagecoach, to witness the execution of Nicholas Behan, the now infamous Wickham Axe Murderer. It was as much morbid spectacle as moral lesson. Public hangings in that era were seen as both entertainment and a stark warning to any who might contemplate heinous crimes. To manage the throngs, authorities called in the Sag Harbor militia. Dozens of armed militiamen in neat uniforms formed a cordon around the gallows that had been erected in the courtyard behind the jail. Their presence kept the crowd from pressing too close and ensured no vigilantes would try to interfere by, say, lynching Nicholas prematurely or rescuing him. The latter was highly unlikely given the crowd's bloodlust. The mood in the crowd was restless, loud, and expectant. Vendors hawked hot cider, chestnuts, and even printed broadsides recounting the Wickham murders and Nicholas's life, grisly souvenirs of the day. It was a bizarre kind of fair, except the main event was a man's death. Shortly after noon, the prison gates opened, and Nicholas was led out under guard. A murmur rippled through the spectators, surging to a roar of mixed jeers and cheers. Many in the front strained to catch a glimpse of the condemned. Nicholas was pale and thin, the past half-year of incarceration having sapped his robustness. His arms were tied behind him, and he wore a simple loose-fitting shirt and trousers provided by the jail. Accounts say he had to be supported by 2 deputies. Whether because of physical weakness or trembling fear is unclear. However, observers noted that he maintained a stoic demeanor. He did not break down or struggle. Perhaps he was in shock or had resigned himself fully to his fate. The gallows in Riverhead's yard was a newer design, a counterweighted trapdoor gallows. Essentially, it had a platform with a mechanism that, when triggered, would drop the condemned swiftly, ideally breaking the neck for a quicker death. A noose of thick hemp rope dangled from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the breeze as Nicholas was positioned beneath it. 181, 182, 183-4, 185, 186, 187, 188, 73. 20 before the hood and noose were applied, Nicholas was allowed to speak his last words, as was custom, if the prisoner desired. A hush fell over the multitude. Those at the back stood on tiptoes or wagons to see. Nicholas's last words were reportedly brief. Some say he quietly said, "Lord, have mercy on my soul," appealing to divine forgiveness, since none would be found on earth for him. Others recalled that he apologized for his crimes in a general sense, perhaps stating, "I alone am responsible for the deaths of James and Francis Wickham, and I am sorry." But it's also possible he said nothing at all when prompted, shaking his head to indicate he had no statement. The exact quotes are lost to time, overshadowed by the spectacle of the execution itself. The executioner, likely the county sheriff or a marshal's, placed a black hood over Nicholas's head. Then the coarse rope was looped around his neck and tightened snugly. In that moment, one can imagine Nicholas's last sensations, the cold bite of the rope fibers on his skin, the sound of the crowd murmuring, and an odd silence in his own mind. Perhaps he thought of Ireland, or of his mother, or felt regret, or perhaps nothing at all but terror. Under the hood, no one could see his expression. At a signal, the trapdoor lever was pulled. With a clank of chains and a whoosh, the drop fell open beneath Nicholas's feet. His body plunged downward about 6 feet and then jerked to an abrupt stop as the rope snapped taut. The intention was to break the neck and cause instantaneous unconsciousness. It's not recorded whether the hangman's calculation was perfect. In some 19th century hangings, if the drop was too short, the prisoner strangled slowly. If too long, decapitation could occur. Given no unusual notes and accounts, likely Nicholas's neck did break, or at least he lost consciousness very quickly. He hung there, swaying slightly as a collective exhale passed through the crowd. Some onlookers cheered or clapped, an ugly display of triumph now that vengeance was fulfilled. Others, especially women and children who had insisted on coming despite the gruesomeness, turned away or wept. Public executions often elicited complex reactions, a mix of satisfaction, revulsion, and sobering reflection. The officials left Nicholas hanging for the standard time, usually around 20 to 30 minutes, to ensure death. Doctors then examined the body, checking for a pulse. When none was found, they pronounced Nicholas Behan dead at age 30, approximately, executed in accordance with the law. Thus ended the life of the man who had brought such horror to an otherwise quiet corner of Long Island. As was customary, the body was cut down and placed in a plain wooden coffin. No family came forward to claim it, or if they did, the record doesn't show. The authorities decided not to bury Nicholas in consecrated ground or any marked grave in town. He was denied even the scandal of a known grave that might attract ghoulish attention or be desecrated by those who hated him. Instead, under guard cover of minimal public knowledge, Nicholas's coffin was transported to the south side of the Peconic River to a place named Egypt and interred in an unmarked grave. This Egypt was likely a remote area or potter's field across the water, chosen for its isolation. There Nicholas's remains would lie, forgotten and unmourned. As the crowd dispersed that afternoon, many undoubtedly felt a grim sense of closure. The villain had met his end. The largest public execution crowd in county history started to trek home, perhaps stopping at taverns on the way to discuss the spectacle over ale. The militia stood down. The rope, hood, and gallows became artifacts. Some piece of the rope was maybe kept by the sheriff's office or by some souvenir hunter who snipped a bit as a macabre keepsake. 171, 172, 189, 190, 191, 192, 24. The North Fork could now begin to truly heal, albeit slowly. Over the next weeks, in parlors and around pot-bellied stoves, people recounted the entire saga, the courtship, the axe, the chase, the hanging. The story became legend almost immediately. Parents might have cautioned unruly children with the fate of Nicholas, behave or you'll end up like that Bane on the gallows. Newspaper editorials pointed to the case as a justification for prejudices or for the necessity of swift justice. And in Cutchogue, the Wickham farm continued on. By the following spring, someone else plowed those fields. New servants dusted the parlor that had once been spattered with blood, perhaps shuddering at the memory. The bedroom where the murders took place was cleaned and eventually put to use again, though likely no one slept in it for some time. The family, James's relatives, probably kept it as a solemn room, perhaps closed off or used for storage, its walls still bearing faint scars or replaced boards where the axe had struck. In time, the events of 1854 took on an almost mythic quality. As Joseph S. Wickham, a descendant, later recounted, the story was whispered around dinner tables to wide-eyed grandchildren. Imagine him describing how he'd sleep in the very room where his ancestors were killed, trying to imagine the horror, then shuddering under the covers at every creak of the old house. Such family lore ensured the Wickham murders would not be merely an entry in a ledger, but a haunting memory passed through generations. For the broader public, the case entered true crime annals. True crime pamphlets and later books like Jeffrey Fleming and Amy Folk's History kept the details alive. The Southold Historical Society preserved artifacts. They had the very murder weapon, the poleaxe, which they put on display in an exhibit many years later. People could gaze at that iron blade and shudder, imagining the gore it had wrought. The exhibit also showed the lock from the jail that held Nicholas and the Bible used to swear in witnesses at his trial. Such tangible pieces bridged the gap of time, making the legend real. Even the home itself, the Wickham farmhouse, stood through the centuries, a silent witness. It still stands today, beautifully preserved, a piece of North Fork history in all its richness. As one article described, visitors to the farm, which in later years became known for its orchards and farm stand, might not immediately sense the dark chapter of 1854 unless told. But for those who know, the aura is there. Some say at night when the wind is right, you can almost hear faint echoes of a woman's scream or feel a chill on the back of your neck in that second-floor room. Ghost stories indeed sprang up. People claimed the Wickham farmhouse was haunted by the restless spirits of James and Francis, or that the axe-wielding devil roamed the fields in penance. These were likely just tales to make sense of what was, at its core, an unfathomable human evil that touched their community. In the final accounting, the Wickham Axe Murders remain one of Long Island's most notorious crimes. They combined all the elements of a ghastly thriller: passionate obsession, class and ethnic tensions, extreme violence, a dramatic manhunt, and ultimate justice served. Truman Capote once showed how a brutal rural murder could captivate the nation and in cold blood. And indeed, a century earlier, this case similarly gripped the public imagination. Like an Erik Larson narrative, it unfolded against a backdrop of social change and brought to light aspects of society, like immigrant labor exploitation and prejudice. And like an Ann Rule case study, it delved into the psychology of a killer whose outward ordinariness masked inner demons. 193, 194, 195, 195, 196, 197, 198, 199, 200, 201, 18, 202, 25. For the general audience, the story endures as a high-stakes cautionary tale that even the most serene communities can suddenly become the stage for unspeakable horror. It underscores how one individual's choices, born perhaps of personal grievances, mental instability, and societal pressures, can unleash devastation on innocent lives. Yet it also highlights the resilience of a community. Cutchogue in 1854 was shattered by this crime, but the people came together to pursue justice and to support each other through the trauma. The Wickham family name lived on not in infamy, but in honor, their farm continuing as a thriving piece of local heritage. In the decades after, the story of the devil in the cornfield would be retold in newspapers, local lore, and historical books, each time with that mix of dread and fascination we feel confronting the darkest capabilities of humanity. As listeners or readers, we sit at the edge of our seats, hearts pounding, even though we know how it ends. We imagine the footsteps on the stairs, the creak of the door, the scream in the night. We imagine the relief as the pistol shot signals capture and the collective sigh when the noose snaps tight. And through it all, we are reminded that these were real people, not just characters. James and Frances Wickham were real, caring people who hoped to live out their days in pastoral peace. Ellen Holland was a real young woman whose quest for a better life in America was nearly destroyed by violence. Nicholas Bahan was a real man shaped by hunger, displacement, anger, and ultimately evil choices. This true crime docu-narrative, as harrowing as it is, preserves the memory of those events with a vividness meant to ensure that their lessons are not forgotten. In the end, the high cost of revenge and rage is laid bare. Nothing was gained by Nicholas's axe, and everything was lost. The fields of Cutchogue eventually turned green again with spring, the blood of victims washed away by rain and time. But the tale of the devil in the cornfield continues to send a chill down the spine, a testament to the fact that even in the most bucolic of places, the past can whisper warnings of how darkness, if unchecked, can turn paradise into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. Gravestone of James and Frances Wickham in Mattituck, New York, Wickham family plot. The inscription marks their tragic deaths on June 2nd, 1854, a somber reminder of the violent events that unfolded in the peaceful hamlet of Cutchogue.